Of all the sciences which interested the sons of men, none had such an attraction for the learned Professor von Baumgarten as psychology and the relations between mind and matter. By experiments which lasted over 20 years he obtained facts upon which he intended to build up a new science which would embrace mesmerism, spiritualism and all related subjects. In this he was much helped by his profound knowledge of physiology which explains the work of the brain, for Alexis von Baumgarten was professor of physiology at the University of Cain-Platz and had a laboratory to help him in his profound researches. Professor von Baumgarten was tall and thin with a long narrow face and steel gray eyes, which were unusually bright and staring. He was popular among the students, who often gathered round him after his lectures and listened enthusiastically to his strange theories. He often called for volunteers from them in order to conduct some experiment. So, there was hardly a fellow in the class who had not, at one time or another, been thrown into a mesmeric trance by his professor. Of all his students there was none who could be compared in enthusiasm with Fritz von Hartmann. He was a clever and hard-working fellow. Months before he had given his heart to young Elise, the blue-eyed, yellow-haired daughter of the professor. Although she was not indifferent to him either, he had never dared to propose to her. So, it would have been difficult for him to see his young lady if he had not made himself useful to the professor. By this means he frequently was asked to the old man's house, where he willingly agreed to be experimented upon in any way in the hope of receiving one glance from Elise or one touch of her little hand. To tell the truth, Fritz had a bad record in Cain-Platz. Never was there a scandal or a duel in which the young student wouldn't take a most active part. No one used more free and violent language, no one drank more, no one played cards more habitually, no one was more idle than he. No wonder that Madame the Professor did not like his presence in the house. As to the Professor, he was too much busy with his strange studies to form a definite opinion of the student. For many years there was one question which had especially interested the professor. 100 times a day he asked himself whether it was possible for the human spirit to exist apart from the body for some time and then to return to it once again. There were many things which made him believe that it was possible for mind to exist apart from matter. At last it occurred to him that by a daring and original experiment the question could be definitely decided. Shortly after the time when the idea of the experiment came to his head the professor was walking home after a long day in the laboratory, when he met a crowd of noisy students who had just come out of a beer house. At the head of them, half drunk, was young Fritz von Hartmann. "Hey, my worthy master," he said, taking the old man by the sleeve. "There is something that I have to say to you, and it is easier for me to say it now, when the good beer is humming in my head, than at another time." "What is it, Fritz?" the physiologist asked, looking at him in surprise. "I know, Professor, that you want to do some wonderful experiment in which you hope to take a man's soul out of his body, and then put it back again. Is it so?" "It is true, Fritz." "And don't you think, my dear sir, that you may have some difficulties in finding someone on whom to try this? Suppose, that the soul went out and wouldn't come back. Who will take the risk?" "But, Fritz," cried out the professor, "I had relied upon your assistance. I am sure you will not desert me." "Then listen," said Fritz solemnly. "If you give your word that after this experiment I may have the hand of your daughter, then I agree to assist you, but if not, I shall have nothing to do with it. These are my terms." "And what would my daughter say to this?" the professor exclaimed after a pause of astonishment. "Elise would be happy," the young man replied. "We love each other." "Then she will be yours," the physiologist said with determination, "for you are a nice young man and one of the best students that I have ever known, of course, when you are not under the influence of alcohol. My experiment is to be performed on the 4th of the next month. It will be a great experiment, Fritz. The best men of science from all South Germany will be there." "I shall be punctual," the student said briefly. And so, the two parted. The professor was right when he spoke of the widespread interest excited by his new psychophysiological experiment. Long before the hour had arrived, the room was filled by a galaxy of talents. There was a storm of applause when Professor von Baumgarten and his assistant appeared upon the platform. The professor in a few well-chosen words explained what his hypothesis was and how he intended to test it. "I believe," he said, "that when a person is under the influence of mesmerism, his spirit is for some time released from his body. I therefore hope that upon mesmerizing my young friend here and then putting myself into a trance, our spirits may be able to communicate together, though our bodies lie still and inert. After a time, our spirits will return into our respective bodies and all will be as before. With your permission, we shall now proceed to make the experiment." The applause was renewed at this speech, and the audience settled down in silence. With a few rapid passes the professor mesmerized the young man who leaned back in his chair, pale and still. He then took a bright glass from his pocket, and by concentrating his gaze upon it and making a strong mental effort, he threw himself into the same condition. It was a strange and impressive sight to see the old man and the young sitting together in the same cataleptic condition. Had their souls left their bodies? That was the question which every one of the audiences asked himself. 5 minutes passed, and then 10, and then 15, and then 15 more, while the professor and his pupil sat stiff upon the platform. During that time not a sound was heard from the assembled scientists, but every eye was put upon the two pale faces, in search of the first signs of returning consciousness. Nearly an hour had passed before the patient watchers were rewarded. A flush came back to the cheeks of Professor von Baumgarten. The soul was coming back to its earthly tenement. Suddenly he stretched out his long thin arms, as one awakening from sleep, stood up from his chair and looked around him as though he hardly realized where he was. Tausendtuf! He exclaimed to the great astonishment of the audience. Where the hell am I then, and what on earth has occurred? Oh yes, I remember now. One of these mesmeric experiments. There is no result this time, for I remember nothing at all since I became unconscious. So you have had all your long journeys for nothing, my learned friends, and it was only a very good joke. And the professor burst into a roar of laughter and slapped his thigh in a highly indecent fashion. The audience got so angry at this unseemly behavior on the part of their host, that there might have been a big scandal, if not the interference of young Fritz von Hartmann, who had now recovered from his lethargy. Stepping to the front of the platform, the young man apologized for the behavior of his companion. I am sorry to say, he said, that he is a harum-scarum sort of fellow, although he seems so grave at the beginning of this experiment. He is still suffering from a mesmeric reaction, and hardly understands what he is saying. As for the experiment itself, I do not consider it to be a failure. My energy will now be devoted to finding some means by which spirits may be able to recall what occurs to them in their free state, and I hope that when I work this out I may have the pleasure of meeting you all once again in this hall and demonstrating to you the result. This address, coming from such a young student, caused considerable astonishment among the audience, and they left the hall, making comparisons between him and his professor, who was laughing heartily in the corner, by no means upset at the failure of the experiment. Now, although all these learned men were leaving the lecture room under the impression that they had seen nothing special, one of the most wonderful things in the whole history of the world had just occurred before their eyes. Professor had been quite correct in his theory that both his spirit and that of his pupil had been for a time absent from his body. But here a strange and unforeseen complication had occurred. On their return the spirit of Fritz von Hartmann entered the body of Alexis von Baumgarten, and that of Alexis von Baumgarten had taken up its place in the frame of Fritz von Hartmann. Hence the slang which came from the lips of the serious professor, and hence also the words and grave statements which fell from the frivolous student. It was an unprecedented event, yet no one knew of it, least of all those whom it concerned. The body of the professor made his way down to the Grünermann, which was one of the favorite places of the students, and ran waving his cane in the air, into the little room where a dozen of half-drunk young men was sitting. "Ha, ha! My boys," he shouted. "I knew I should find you here. Drink up, every one of you, and order what you like, for I'm going to treat you today." Had the green man who was depicted upon the signpost of that well-known inn suddenly marched into the room and called for a bottle of wine, the students could not have been more amazed than they were by this unexpected appearance of their respected professor. They were so astonished that for a minute or two they looked at him without being able to make any reply to his invitation. "Damn it!" shouted the professor angrily. "What the devil is the matter with you? You sit there like a set of stuck pigs staring at me." "What is it, then?" "It is the unexpected honor," muttered one of the students. "Honor? Nonsense!" said the professor. "Do you think that just because I was demonstrating mesmerism to a group of old fools, I am too proud to drink with my dear old friends? Beer, wine and schnapps, my boys, order what you like and put it all down to me. Never was there such an afternoon in the Gruner Mann." Soon the students lost their shyness in the presence of their professor. As for him, he shouted, he sang, he laughed and offered to run 100 yards against any member of the company. "Gentlemen," said the professor, standing up at the end of the table, "I must now explain to you what is the cause of this festivity. The fact is, my friends, that I hope very soon to be married." "Married!" cried out one of the students in astonishment. "Is Madame dead then?" "Madame? Who?" "Why, Madame von Baumgarten, of course." "Ha, ha!" laughed the professor. "I can see, then, that you know all about my former difficulties. No, she is not dead, but I have reason to believe that she will not oppose my marriage. And I hope you will come to my wedding, all of you. Here is to my little bride." And the professor waved his glass in the air. And so the fun went on, and each young fellow followed the professor's example and drank a toast to the girl of his heart. While all this festivity had been going on at the Gruner Mann, a very different scene took place in another place. Young Fritz von Hartmann with a grave face and reserved manners had walked out into the street and went slowly in the direction of the house of the professor. He was hurrying along when he saw two students. These youths, instead of raising their caps or showing any sign of respect, rushed at him, seized him by each arm and began dragging him along with them. "What is the matter?" roared von Hartmann. "Where are you taking me?" "To drink a bottle of wine with us," said the two students. "Come along." "That is an invitation which you have never refused." "I never heard of such insolence in my life." cried von Hartmann. Let go my arms. You shall certainly be punished for this. Let me go, I say. Oh, if you are ill-tempered, you may go where you like, the students said, releasing him. We can do very well without you. I know you. You'll pay for it, said von Hartmann furiously, and continued his way in the direction which he imagined to be his own home. Madame von Baumgarten, who was looking out of the window and wondering why her husband was late for dinner, was greatly astonished to see the young student come down the garden path with the air of one who is master of the situation. Good day, sir, she greeted him gloomily, standing in the open doorway. A very fine day indeed, Martha, answered the other. Now, don't stand there like a statue, but get the dinner ready, for I am very hungry. Martha. Dinner, cried out the lady, falling back in astonishment. Yes, dinner, Martha, dinner, shouted von Hartmann, who was becoming annoyed. Is there anything wonderful in that request when a man has been out all day? There you are, standing staring again. Woman, will you or will you not give me dinner? The last words, accompanied by a blow, had the effect of sending Madame Baumgarten flying along the corridor and through the kitchen, where she locked herself up and burst into violent hysterics. In the meantime von Hartmann entered the room and threw himself down upon the sofa in rage. At this moment Elise came downstairs and threw herself into the arms of what she imagined to be her lover. Dearest, she cried, kissing him passionately. I know this is all done for my sake. It is a trick in order to see me. Von Hartmann's anger at this new attack upon him was so great that he became speechless for a minute from rage. Then he cried out, stamping upon the floor, Never have I passed such a day in my life. My experiment has failed. 2 students have dragged me along the public road. My wife becomes furious when I ask her for dinner, and my daughter flies at me and hugs me like a grizzly bear. With these words von Hartmann seized his hat and rushed off into the town with the intention of seeking in some inn the food and comfort which he could not find at home. As the spirit of Professor von Baumgarten and the frame of von Hartmann walked down the pathway which led to the little town, he became aware that an old man was approaching him singing a student's song in a drunken voice. As he came nearer, he became convinced that he knew the other well, though he could not recall when or where he had met him. Well, Sonny, said the drunken man, examining von Hartmann and swaying about in front of him, where have I seen you before? I know you as well as I know myself. Who the devil are you? I am Professor von Baumgarten, said the student. May I ask who you are? Your face is strangely familiar to me. You should never tell lies, young man, said the other. "You're certainly not the professor, for he is an ugly old chap, and you are a big young fellow. As for myself, I am Fritz von Hartmann at your service." "You are certainly not," exclaimed the body of von Hartmann. "You may be his father. But hello, sir, are you aware that you are wearing my tie and my watch?" "Damn it!" cried out the other. "If these are not the trousers which I made last week, may I never taste beer again." At this moment Professor von Baumgarten chanced to see the reflection of his own face in a pool which the rain had left upon the road. To his astonishment he saw that his face was that of a youth, that his dress was that of a fashionable young student, and that in every way he did not look like himself. In an instant his active brain ran over the series of events which had occurred that day and came to the conclusion. "Damn it," he cried, "I see it all. Our souls are in the wrong bodies. I am you and you are I. My theory is proved, but at what an expense. Will the most brilliant mind in Europe have to go about with this frivolous exterior? Oh, the work of a lifetime is ruined." And he beat his breast in despair. "If I thought so," said the spirit of the student, "it would be hard indeed. What could I do with these old bones, and how could I convince Elise that I was not her father? No, thank God, in spite of the beer I can see a way out of it." "How?" exclaimed the professor. "Why, by repeating the experiment. Release our souls once more, and the chances are that they will find their way back into their respective bodies." No drowning man could clutch more eagerly at a straw than did von Baumgarten's spirit at this suggestion. Some students and peasants who chanced to pass during the next hour were much amazed to see the old professor of physiology and his favorite student both sitting upon a very dirty bench and both completely insensible. Before the hour was up a big crowd had assembled, and they were discussing the necessity of sending for an ambulance, when the learned scientist opened his eyes and gazed around him. For an instant he seemed to forget how he had come here, but the next moment he astonished the audience by waving his skinny arms above his head and crying out in delight, "My God! I am myself again! I feel I am!" And the student, jumping up to his feet, burst into the same cry and the two performed a sort of a dance in the middle of the road. It was long before the peaceful atmosphere returned to the professor's house and longer still before the face of von Hartmann was seen under its roof. However, the student finally married the blue-eyed daughter of the professor, and his loving wife Elise presented him with two little children as a visible sign of her affection.